The boy's name was Santiago. Dusk was falling as the boy arrived with his herd at an abandoned church. The roof had fallen in long ago, and an enormous sycamore had grown on the spot where the sacristy had once stood. He decided to spend the night there. He saw to it that all the sheep entered through the ruined gate, and then laid some planks across it to prevent the flock from wandering away during the night. There were no wolves in the region, but once an animal had strayed during the night, and the boy had had to spend the entire next day searching for it. He swept the floor with his jacket and lay down, using the book he had just finished reading as a pillow. He told himself that he would have to start reading thicker books. They lasted longer and made more comfortable pillows. It was still dark when he awoke, and, looking up, he could see the stars through the half-destroyed roof. I wanted to sleep a little longer, he thought. He had had the same dream that night as a week ago, and once again he had awakened before it ended. He arose and, taking up his crook, began to awaken the sheep that still slept. He had noticed that as soon as he awoke, most of his animals also began to stir. It was as if some mysterious energy bound his life to that of the sheep, with whom he had spent the past 2 years leading them through the countryside in search of food and water. "They are so used to me that they know my schedule," he muttered. Thinking about that for a moment, he realized that it could be the other way around, that it was he who had become accustomed to their schedule. But there were certain of them who took a bit longer to awaken. The boy prodded them one by one with his crook, calling each by name. He had always believed that the sheep were able to understand what he said, so there were times when he read them parts of his books that had made an impression on him, or when he would tell them of the loneliness or the happiness of a shepherd in the fields. Sometimes he would comment to them on the things he had seen in the villages they passed. But for the past few days, he had spoken to them about only one thing: the girl, the daughter of a merchant who lived in the village they would reach in about 4 days. He had been to the village only once, the year before. The merchant was the proprietor of a dry goods shop, and he always demanded that the sheep be sheared in his presence so that he would not be cheated. A friend had told the boy about the shop, and he had taken his sheep there. "I need to sell some wool," the boy told the merchant. The shop was busy, and the man asked the shepherd to wait until the afternoon, so the boy sat on the steps of the shop and took a book from his bag. "I didn't know shepherds knew how to read," said a girl's voice behind him.
The girl was typical of the region of Andalusia, with flowing black hair and eyes that vaguely recalled the Moorish conquerors. "Well, usually I learn more from my sheep than from books," he answered. During the 2 hours that they talked, she told him she was the merchant's daughter and spoke of life in the village, where each day was like all the others. The shepherd told her of the Andalusian countryside and related the news from the other towns where he had stopped. It was a pleasant change from talking to his sheep. During their meeting a year ago, Santiago asked her how he had learned to read. He told her he had learned in school, just like everyone else. This prompted her to ask why, if he were literate, he was just a shepherd. Santiago gave a vague, non-committal answer to avoid the question, believing she wouldn't truly understand his reasons. As he continued telling her stories of his travels, her dark Moorish eyes widened with a mix of surprise and fear. Santiago found himself wishing that the merchant would stay busy for days so that he wouldn't have to leave. For the first time, he experienced a sensation he had never known, the desire to stay in one place forever. He felt that life with this girl would change his days entirely. Eventually, the merchant appeared, paid Santiago to shear 4 sheep, and told him to return the following year. His parents, who were simple farmers, had hoped he would become a priest to bring pride to the family. To that end, he had studied Latin, Spanish, and theology. However, since childhood, his true desire was to see the world, which he felt was more important than studying God or human sin.
On a visit home, he finally gathered the courage to tell his father that he did not want to be a priest and that he intended to travel instead. "People from all over the world have passed through this village, son," said his father. "They come in search of new things, but when they leave, they are basically the same people they were when they arrived. They climb the mountain to see the castle, and they wind up thinking that the past was better than what we have now. They have blonde hair or dark skin, but basically they're the same as the people who live right here." "But I'd like to see the castles in the towns where they live," the boy explained. "Those people, when they see our land, say that they would like to live here forever," his father continued. "Well, I'd like to see their land and see how they live," said his son. "The people who come here have a lot of money to spend, so they can afford to travel," his father said. "Amongst us, the only ones who travel are the shepherds." "Well, then I'll be a shepherd." His father said no more. The next day, he gave his son a pouch that held 3 ancient Spanish gold coins. "I found these one day in the fields. I wanted them to be a part of your inheritance, but use them to buy your flock. Take to the fields, and someday you'll learn that our countryside is the best, and our women are the most beautiful."
And he gave the boy his blessing. The boy could see in his father's gaze a desire to be able, himself, to travel the world. A desire that was still alive despite his father's having had to bury it over dozens of years under the burden of struggling for water to drink, food to eat, and the same place to sleep every night of his life. The horizon was tinged with red, and suddenly the sun appeared. The boy thought back to that conversation with his father and felt happy. He had already seen many castles and met many women, but none the equal of the one who awaited him several days hence. He owned a jacket, a book that he could trade for another, and a flock of sheep. But most important, he was able every day to live out his dream. If he were to tire of the Andalusian fields, he could sell his sheep and go to sea. By the time he had had enough of the sea, he would already have known other cities, other women, and other chances to be happy. "I couldn't have found God in the seminary," he thought, as he looked at the sunrise. Whenever he could, he sought out a new road to travel. He had never been to that ruined church before, in spite of having traveled through those parts many times. The world was huge and inexhaustible. He only had to allow his sheep to set the route for a while, and he would discover other interesting things. The problem is that they don't even realize that they're walking a new road every day. They don't see that the fields are new and the seasons change. All they think about is food and water. "Maybe we're all that way," the boy mused. "Even me. I haven't thought of other women since I met the merchant's daughter." Looking at the sun, he calculated that he would reach Tarifa before midday. There, he could exchange his book for a thicker one, fill his wine bottle, shave, and have a haircut. He had to prepare himself for his meeting with the girl, and he didn't want to think about the possibility that some other shepherd with a larger flock of sheep had arrived there before him and asked for her hand. It's the possibility of having a dream come true that makes life interesting, he thought, as he looked again at the position of the sun and hurried his pace. He had suddenly remembered that in Tarifa there was an old woman who interpreted dreams. The old woman guided Santiago to a room in the back of her home, partitioned from the main living area by a curtain made of colored beads. The room was sparsely furnished with only a table, 2 chairs, and an image of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Once they were seated, the woman grasped both of his hands and began a low, quiet prayer. Santiago thought it sounded like a gypsy prayer. Having encountered gypsies on the road before, people who traveled like him but without flocks, he felt a surge of childhood fear. He recalled the common prejudices that gypsies were tricksters, made pacts with the devil, and kidnapped children to serve as slaves in their hidden camps. To calm himself, he focused on the image of the Sacred Heart of Jesus and silently recited an Our Father, hoping to prevent his hands from trembling and revealing his terror. The woman stared at his hands and remarked, "Very interesting. before falling silent. Her scrutiny made Santiago so nervous that his hands did begin to shake. He eventually pulled his hands away, snapping that he hadn't come for a palm reading. At that moment, he regretted the visit entirely and considered simply paying her fee to leave, feeling that perhaps he was overthinking a mere dream. The woman countered by stating that he had come to understand his dreams, which she described as the language of God. She explained her specialty. If God speaks in a human language, she can interpret it. However, if he speaks in the language of the soul, only the dreamer can understand. Regardless of the difficulty, she made it clear she would still be charging for the consultation. Santiago suspected this was just another trick, but he decided to take the risk, comparing the gamble to the everyday dangers a shepherd faces with wolves and drought. Santiago explained that he had experienced the same dream twice. In the dream, he was in a field with his sheep when a child appeared and began to play with the animals. Usually, Santiago disliked strangers touching his sheep because the animals were fearful of people they didn't know, yet they seemed perfectly calm with children. He mused on how animals somehow instinctively know a human's age. The woman, growing impatient and mentioning she had cooking to finish, urged him to continue. She noted that since he didn't have much money, she couldn't give him much more of her time. Santiago, slightly annoyed by the rush, finished his story. After playing with the sheep for a while, the child suddenly took him by both hands and transported him to the Egyptian pyramids. Santiago paused after mentioning the Egyptian pyramids, waiting to see if the old woman even knew what they were. When she remained silent, he continued slowly. In the dream, a child told him that if he traveled to the pyramids, he would find a hidden treasure. Just as the child was about to reveal the exact spot, Santiago woke up, both times. The woman studied his hands again and made a surprising offer. She wouldn't charge him anything at that moment. Instead, she demanded 1/10 of the treasure if he eventually found it. Santiago laughed with relief, happy that he could keep his actual money and only pay with a dream treasure. After he swore twice to the deal while looking at the image of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, she gave her interpretation. She claimed that because a child showed him the pyramids, they must exist. Her advice was simple: go to the pyramids in Egypt. There, he would find a treasure that would make him a wealthy man. Santiago felt cheated and irritated. He felt he didn't need to visit a gypsy just to be told something so obvious. The woman defended herself, explaining that while the interpretation seemed simple, the simplest things in life are actually the most extraordinary, and only the truly wise can understand them. Since she admitted she wasn't wise, she had to rely on other skills, like palm reading. When Santiago asked how he was supposed to get to Egypt, she bluntly told him she only interpreted dreams. She didn't know how to make them real. If he never made it there, she simply wouldn't get paid, which she noted had happened to her before. Then she dismissed him, saying he had already wasted enough of her time. Disappointed and skeptical, Santiago decided he was done believing in dreams. He focused on his errands. He bought food, traded his old book for a thicker one, and found a bench in the plaza to drink some new wine. His sheep were safely stored in a friend's stable at the city gates. He reflected on why he loved traveling. It allowed him to make many friends without the burden of staying with them. He contrasted this with his time at the seminary, noting that when you see the same people every day, they eventually try to change you to fit their expectations. He observed that most people seem to have a very clear idea of how others should live their lives, yet they have no idea how to lead their own. Santiago decided to wait for the heat of the day to pass before returning to his flock. He thought about the merchant's daughter, whom he would see in 3 days. He began reading his new, thicker book. The first page described a burial ceremony with names that were incredibly difficult to pronounce. He thought that if he ever wrote a book, he'd introduce characters one at a time so the reader wouldn't get confused. Despite the difficult names, he enjoyed the book because the snowy setting of the funeral made him feel cool in the sweltering heat. As he finally began to focus, an old man sat down next to him and asked what the people in the plaza were doing. Santiago, wanting to be left alone with his book, answered curtly, "Working." Though he tried to read, Santiago's mind kept drifting back to the merchant's daughter. He imagined himself shearing his sheep in front of her to prove he was capable of difficult work. He even planned out the conversation, imagining her fascination as he explained the technical detail that sheep must be sheared from back to front. He also intended to tell her various stories he had read in books, but planned to frame them as if they were his own personal adventures, knowing she couldn't read and would never know the difference. The old man was relentless in his attempt to talk to Santiago. Claiming he was both exhausted and thirsty, he asked the boy for a drink of his wine. Santiago handed over the bottle, privately hoping that by satisfying the man's thirst, he would finally be left alone.
However, the man continued the interaction by asking about the book Santiago was reading. Although the boy was tempted to be rude and move to a different bench, he remembered his father's advice to always respect his elders. He decided to show the man the book for two specific reasons. He wasn't entirely sure how to pronounce the title himself, and he hoped the old man was illiterate and would leave out of embarrassment once confronted with a book he couldn't read. To Santiago's astonishment, the man examined the book and remarked that it was an important book, but it's really irritating. This shocked the boy. Not only could the man read, but he had already read this specific volume. Santiago briefly considered trading the book for another if it truly was as annoying as the man suggested. The old man explained that this book shared the same message as almost every other book. It claimed that people are incapable of choosing their own personal legends. Furthermore, it promoted what he called the world's greatest lie. When a surprised Santiago asked what that lie was, the man defined it: the belief that at a certain point we lose control of our lives and they become governed by fate. Santiago disagreed, stating that the lie hadn't applied to him because he had rejected his parents' wish for him to be a priest in favor of becoming a shepherd. The old man agreed, noting that this was a better choice since Santiago truly enjoyed traveling. Santiago was startled, realizing the man seemed to know exactly what he was thinking. As the man flipped through the book without showing any sign of returning it, Santiago studied his clothing. He looked like an Arab, which was a common sight in Tarifa given its proximity to Africa across the narrow straits. Santiago asked where the man was from, and the stranger replied, "From many places." Santiago challenged this, arguing that while he traveled to many places, he was only from one, a city near an ancient castle where he was born. The man then claimed he had been born in Salem. Santiago had no idea where Salem was, but kept quiet to avoid looking ignorant. He watched the busy people in the plaza before asking what Salem was like. The old man cryptically replied, "It's like it always has been." Knowing it wasn't in Andalusia, Santiago pressed further, asking what the man did there. The old man laughed and declared, "I'm the king of Salem." Santiago began to think that people were far more difficult to deal with than sheep or books. Sheep remained silent, and books only told their stories when you wanted to hear them. People, however, said things so bizarre that they made conversation impossible. The old man then introduced himself as Melchizedek and asked Santiago exactly how many sheep he owned. Santiago defensively answered that he had enough, but Melchizedek told him that was a problem. He couldn't provide help to someone who felt they already had enough sheep.
Santiago's irritation peaked. He hadn't asked for help, yet this stranger was now demanding 1/10 of his sheep in exchange for information about a treasure Santiago wasn't even sure existed. He suspected the old man was a gypsy, perhaps the husband of the dream interpreter, trying to swindle him for even more than the woman had. Before Santiago could walk away, the old man began writing in the sand with a stick. A brilliant light flashed from his chest, momentarily blinding the boy. When Santiago's vision cleared, he looked at the sand and was stunned into silence. There, written in the dust, were the names of his parents, the seminary he attended, and even the name of the merchant's daughter, a name Santiago hadn't even known himself. The old man had listed secrets Santiago had never shared with anyone. Awed and embarrassed, Santiago asked why a king would bother talking to a simple shepherd. Melchizedek explained that it was because Santiago had discovered his personal legend. He defined this as the thing a person has always wanted to accomplish, the dream people hold in their youth when everything feels possible and they aren't afraid to yearn for greatness. He warned that as time passes, a mysterious force convinces people that their dreams are impossible. However, he clarified that this force isn't actually negative. It prepares a person's spirit and will. He shared a core truth of the universe. When you really want something, it's because that desire originated in the soul of the universe. It's your mission on Earth. He told Santiago that the soul of the world is fed by happiness and even by negative emotions like envy. But a person's only real obligation is to realize their own destiny. He famously added that when you truly want something, the entire universe conspires to help you achieve it. To illustrate his point, the old man pointed to a baker across the plaza. He revealed that as a child, the baker also wanted to travel, but he chose to buy a shop and save money first, intending to travel when he was old. The baker failed to realize that one can pursue their dreams at any time. Santiago suggested the man should have become a shepherd instead. Melchizedek agreed that the baker had considered it, but ultimately decided that bakers are more important than shepherds. Bakers have houses and social standing, whereas shepherds sleep outdoors. Parents prefer their daughters to marry bakers. This realization gave Santiago a pang in his heart as he worried the merchant's daughter might feel the same way. The old man concluded that eventually what people think of them becomes more important to most people than their own personal legends. As the old man began reading a random page in Santiago's book, the boy interrupted him, asking why he was sharing all of this information. The old man explained that it was because Santiago was currently attempting to realize his personal legend, but he was at the exact moment where he was about to give up. Santiago asked if the old man always appeared at such times. Melchizedek replied that he does, though not always in this specific form. Sometimes he arrives as a solution or a brilliant idea. Other times, he simply makes a crucial moment easier to navigate. He noted that he often works behind the scenes without people even realizing he has intervened. To illustrate his point, the old man told a story about a miner who had sacrificed everything to find emeralds. For 5 years, the man had worked a river, examining hundreds of thousands of stones without success. Just as the miner was about to quit, needing to check only one more stone to find his prize, the old man decided to intervene because the man had been so dedicated to his personal legend. The old man transformed himself into a common stone and rolled up to the miner's foot. In a fit of anger and frustration over his 5 failed years, the miner picked up the stone and threw it away. However, he threw it so hard that it struck another rock and shattered it, revealing the most beautiful emerald in the world hidden inside. The old man remarked with some bitterness that people often learn their reason for being early in life, but perhaps that is also why they give up on it so quickly. Santiago shifted the conversation back to the hidden treasure. The old man noted that treasure is both uncovered and buried by the force of flowing water. He told Santiago that if he wanted to know where his treasure was, he would have to give up 1/10 of his flock. When Santiago offered 1/10 of the treasure instead, the old man expressed disappointment. He warned that if you promise something you don't even possess yet, you will lose the motivation to actually work for it. Santiago mentioned he had already made that same promise to the gypsy. The old man sighed, calling gypsies experts at such bargains, but noted it was a good lesson. Everything in life has a price. This, he said, was a teaching of the warriors of the light. The old man returned the book and gave Santiago a deadline. Bring 1/10 of the sheep to the plaza at the same time the next day, and he would reveal the location of the treasure. Then he vanished. Santiago tried to return to his book, but found he couldn't concentrate. He was anxious because he felt the old man was right. He bought a loaf of bread and briefly considered telling the baker what the old man had said about him. However, he decided against it, reasoning that it was better to leave things be. If he spoke up, the baker might spend days in an anxious state thinking about giving up his settled life, and Santiago didn't want to cause him that distress. Santiago wandered to the city gates and found a ticket window where people bought passage to Africa. Knowing that Egypt was located there, he realized that selling just one sheep would provide enough money to cross the strait. The idea terrified him. When the ticket seller asked if he could help, Santiago replied, "Maybe tomorrow," and walked away. The ticket seller dismissed him as just another dreamer who lacked the funds to actually travel. As Santiago walked away, his thoughts returned to the safety of his flock. He reminded himself that in 2 years he had become an expert shepherd. He knew how to shear, care for ewes, and defend against wolves. He knew every pasture in Andalusia and exactly what each of his animals was worth. He was weighing the expertise and comfort he already possessed against the frightening unknown of the other shore. To delay his return, Santiago took the longest possible path back to his friend's stable. He stopped at the city's castle and climbed the stone ramp to the top of the wall. From that vantage point, he could see Africa in the distance and remembered being told that the Moors had once crossed from there to occupy Spain.
He could see the entire city, including the plaza where he had met Melchizedek. He briefly cursed the moment he met the old man, feeling that he had only wanted his dream interpreted, not his life upended. He felt that neither the old woman nor the king of Salem understood the deep bond between a shepherd and his flock. Santiago knew every intimate detail of his animals, which ones were lame, which were lazy, and which ewe was due to give birth in 2 months. He knew how to shear them and how to slaughter them, and he worried they would suffer if he abandoned them. A strong wind began to blow, known as the Levanter because it carried the Moors from the Levant. As the wind intensified, Santiago realized he was caught between the life he was accustomed to, his sheep, and the life he wanted, the treasure. He thought of the merchant's daughter, but realized she was less of a tie than his flock because she didn't depend on him. In fact, she might not even remember him. He mused that for her, every day was the same because she failed to see the good things that happen with every sunrise. He then rationalized that just as his parents and his hometown had gotten used to his absence, his sheep would eventually adapt as well. Looking down at the plaza, he saw the baker's shop and a young couple kissing on the very bench where he had sat. The Levanter grew even stronger, bringing with it the scent of the desert and the sweat and dreams of men who had sought the unknown, gold and the pyramids. Santiago felt a surge of jealousy toward the wind's freedom and realized he could possess that same freedom if he chose. He concluded that his sheep, the girl, and the fields of Andalusia were merely steps on his path toward his personal legend. The following day at noon, Santiago met the old man and brought 6 sheep. He explained that a friend had immediately bought the rest of the flock, claiming he had always dreamed of being a shepherd and saw the opportunity as a good omen. Melchizedek wasn't surprised, calling this the principle of favorability or beginner's luck. He explained that there is a force in the universe that wants you to succeed, so it gives you a taste of success early on to whet your appetite. As the old man inspected the 6 sheep, he noticed one was lame. Santiago defended the animal, noting it was the most intelligent and produced the most wool. Finally, Santiago asked for the location of the treasure. The old man confirmed it was in Egypt, near the pyramids. Though Santiago was startled that the answer was identical to the gypsy woman's, Melchizedek gave him a crucial piece of advice. To find the treasure, he must follow the omens that God has left for everyone to read. Before Santiago could say a word, a butterfly fluttered between him and the old man. This triggered a memory of his grandfather, who had taught him that butterflies, along with crickets, grasshoppers, lizards, and 4-leaf clovers, were all positive omens. Reading the boy's thoughts, the old man confirmed that his grandfather was correct. Then the old man opened his cape, revealing a spectacular breastplate of solid gold encrusted with precious gems. Santiago realized the brilliant flash he had seen the day before came from this armor. He was now certain the man was truly a king, likely traveling in a simple disguise to avoid being targeted by thieves. The king reached into the center of his golden breastplate and pulled out 2 stones, one white and one black. He gave them to Santiago, explaining they were named Urim and Thummim. The black stone signifies yes, the white stone signifies no. He instructed Santiago to use them only when he was absolutely unable to decipher the omens on his own, emphasizing that he must always ask the stones objective questions. However, his primary advice was for the boy to strive to make his own decisions whenever possible. The king admitted he had insisted on the payment of 6 sheep specifically because he had helped Santiago arrive at a decision. Santiago placed the stones in his pouch, resolved to take ownership of his future.
Before departing, the king offered a few last warnings. Remember that everything you encounter is ultimately part of only one thing. Do not forget the language of omens. Most importantly, follow your personal legend until the very end. To conclude their meeting, the king shared a story about a shopkeeper's son who traveled for 40 days across the desert to find the wisest man in the world who lived in a beautiful mountain castle. Instead of a quiet, saintly environment, the boy entered a hall filled with intense activity, merchants talking, a small orchestra playing music, and a table overflowing with the region's finest food. The wise man was so busy that the boy had to wait 2 hours for his turn. When they finally spoke, the wise man said he didn't have time to explain the secret of happiness just yet. He told the boy to explore the palace and return in 2 hours. The wise man gave the boy a teaspoon containing 2 drops of oil and told him to carry it throughout his tour without spilling a single drop. The boy spent the 2 hours climbing and descending the palace stairs with his eyes locked onto the spoon. When he returned, the wise man asked if he had noticed the Persian tapestries, the master gardener's 10-year project, or the rare parchments in the library. Embarrassed, the boy confessed he had seen nothing because he was entirely focused on the oil. The wise man sent him back out, stating, "You cannot trust a man if you don't know his house." Relieved, the boy took the spoon again and this time immersed himself in the beauty of the castle. He observed the art on the ceilings, the mountain views, and the exquisite taste of the gardens. Upon his return, he excitedly described every detail he had seen to the wise man. The wise man looked at the boy and asked where the 2 drops of oil were. Looking down, the boy realized the spoon was empty. The oil had spilled. The wise man then offered his singular piece of advice. The secret to a happy life is to appreciate all the marvels of the world without ever forgetting the drops of oil on your spoon. Santiago remained silent, fully grasping the lesson. He understood that while a shepherd may love to wander and see new lands, he must never lose sight of his sheep. Melchizedek, the king of Salem, performed a series of strange gestures with his hands over Santiago's head, then gathered the 6 sheep and walked away.
That afternoon, the king sat atop the old Moorish fort at the highest point in Tarifa. As the Levanter wind blew against his face, he watched the restless sheep who were anxious about their new owner and the sudden changes in their lives. He observed a small ship leaving the port, knowing he would never see Santiago again, just as he had never seen Abraham again after their transaction. He reflected that while gods shouldn't have desires, he desperately hoped the boy would succeed. He felt a brief pang of regret that he hadn't repeated his name more often, so the boy would remember him as Melchizedek. Looking toward the sky, he admitted his own vanity to God, acknowledging that even an old king needs to take a little pride in his work. Santiago, meanwhile, found himself in a bar in Tangier. The atmosphere was alien to him. It reminded him of other bars, yet everything was different. He saw men sharing a giant pipe, women with veiled faces, and men walking hand in hand. He watched as priests climbed towers to chant, prompting everyone around him to kneel and press their foreheads to the ground. Santiago felt isolated and ill. He viewed these people as infidels and recalled childhood images of Saint Santiago Matamoros, the Moor slayer, on his white horse. He felt a deep sense of loneliness and was struck by a detail he had overlooked. He didn't speak a word of Arabic. He ordered a drink by pointing at what another customer was having, but it turned out to be a bitter tea rather than the wine he preferred. However, he tried to stay positive. He had money in his pouch from the sale of his sheep, and he believed that money held a certain magic. Those who have it are never truly alone. He reasoned that a king with a golden breastplate wouldn't have lied to him just to get 6 sheep. The treasure must be real.
He began to think about the omens the king had mentioned. During his years as a shepherd, he had already learned to read the language of the world. A certain bird meant a snake was near, and a specific shrub signaled water. He concluded that if God leads sheep so well, he would surely lead a man. With this thought, the tea suddenly tasted less bitter. At that moment, a voice spoke to him in Spanish, asking, "Who are you?" Santiago felt an immediate sense of relief, viewing the appearance of a fellow Spanish speaker as a positive omen. Santiago was relieved when a young man, roughly his own age and height, addressed him in Spanish. Although the newcomer wore Western clothes, his skin tone suggested he was a local. He explained that since Spain was only 2 hours away, many people in Tangier spoke the language. Santiago invited the man to sit and offered to buy him a drink, asking for wine to replace the bitter tea. The young man informed him that wine was strictly forbidden by the local religion. Santiago then shared his goal. He needed to reach the pyramids. He carefully avoided mentioning the treasure, remembering the king's warning about promising things one doesn't yet possess. Instead, he simply offered to pay the man to serve as his guide. The guide explained that reaching the pyramids required crossing the entire Sahara Desert, which would be expensive. He asked Santiago if he had enough money. Trusting in the king's philosophy that the universe conspires to help those who want something, Santiago pulled out his pouch and showed his money to the young man. The owner of the bar, who had been listening intently, approached the guide and spoke to him in Arabic. The owner seemed irritated, and the guide told Santiago they needed to leave immediately. As Santiago tried to pay the bill, the owner grabbed him and began shouting angrily in Arabic. The guide pushed the owner aside and pulled Santiago out into the street, warning him that the owner wanted his money and that Tangier, as a port city, was infested with thieves. Santiago felt a deep sense of trust in his new friend, who had seemingly protected him from a robbery. The guide took Santiago's money, stating he needed to buy 2 camels so they could reach the pyramids by the next day. They walked through the narrow, bustling streets of Tangier until they reached a massive plaza filled with thousands of people buying and selling everything from vegetables and tobacco to carpets and daggers. Santiago made sure to keep a constant eye on the guide, who was carrying all his funds. He considered asking the money back, but decided against it, fearing he would appear unfriendly or ignorant of local customs. He told himself he was stronger than the guide and would simply watch him closely. In the middle of the chaotic market, Santiago's attention was suddenly seized by a magnificent sword. Its scabbard was embossed in silver, and its black handle was encrusted with precious stones. He was so captivated that he promised himself he would buy it on his return trip from Egypt. He asked his friend to find out the price of the sword from the stall owner. In that moment, he realized he had been distracted for a few seconds. A wave of dread washed over him, and he felt as though his chest were physically compressed. He remained staring at the sword for a few more moments, terrified to turn around and confirm what he already felt in his heart. Santiago stood in the middle of the bustling market, surrounded by the shouting of vendors and the scents of unfamiliar spices, but his new friend was nowhere to be found. At first, he tried to convince himself that they had simply been separated by the crowd and decided to stay put, waiting for the young man to return. As he waited, a priest climbed a tower and began to chant. Immediately, the entire market came to a standstill. Everyone knelt, touched their foreheads to the ground, and joined the prayer. Then, as quickly as they had gathered, the merchants dismantled their stalls, and the plaza emptied out, leaving Santiago alone. As the sun dipped behind the white houses of the city, Santiago reflected on how much his life had changed in a single day. That very morning, he was in Spain, a confident shepherd with 60 sheep and a plan to see a girl he liked. In his own country, he knew exactly what his day would hold.
Now, just a few hours later, he was a stranger in a foreign land where he couldn't understand the language. He had lost his flock, his money, and his sense of direction. He felt a deep sense of self-pity, realizing that everything he had built was gone between sunrise and sunset. Santiago felt such intense shame that he began to weep, something he had never done, even in front of his sheep. In the silence of the empty marketplace, he felt that God was being unfair, punishing him for believing in his dreams. He spiraled into dark thoughts, imagining that he would become a bitter, distrustful man who hated others for finding their treasures. He felt small and insignificant, deciding that he would have to cling to whatever little he had left because he wasn't strong enough to conquer the world. Looking for any scrap of food that might be left in his pouch, he found only 3 items: his heavy book, his jacket. Seeing the stones brought him a sudden, strange sense of relief. He realized that while he had lost his sheep, he still possessed 2 precious stones taken from a king's golden breastplate. He reasoned that he could sell them to buy a ticket back to Spain. He told himself that this time he would be smarter. He moved the stones from his pouch to his pocket, acknowledging that the only true thing the thief had told him was that port towns are indeed full of robbers. Santiago finally understood why the old man had been so angry the day before. The man wasn't trying to rob him, but was actually trying to warn him against trusting the thief. Santiago realized he had fallen into a common trap, seeing the world as he wished it to be, rather than how it actually was. However, as he felt the smooth surfaces of Urim and Thummim, his spirits lifted. The stones were physical proof that his encounter with the king of Salem hadn't been a dream. He remembered the king's promise: when you want something, all the universe conspires in helping you to achieve it. Santiago decided to test the stones. Following the king's advice to ask objective questions, he first asked if the old man's blessing was still with him. He pulled a stone. Yes. Next, he prepared to ask if he would find his treasure, but as he reached into his pouch, both stones slipped through a hole in the fabric and fell to the ground. Santiago hadn't realized his pouch was torn. As he knelt to retrieve them, he recalled another of the king's instructions: learn to recognize omens and follow them. He smiled, viewing the fallen stones as an omen in themselves. He decided not to fix the hole. The stones could fall out whenever they chose. He realized there are some things a person shouldn't ask so they don't spoil their own journey. He reaffirmed his promise to make his own decisions. Looking at the empty plaza, Santiago no longer saw a strange place, but a new one. He realized that even if he never reached the pyramids, he had already traveled further than any shepherd he knew. He looked at his situation through a new lens. He wasn't a poor victim of a thief, but an adventurer in quest of his treasure. Santiago fell asleep in the plaza and was woken up as the market began to come to life again. He felt a strange happiness. He was no longer burdened by the need to find water and food for sheep. He was free to seek his treasure. He wandered through the market and helped a candy seller set up his stall. He noticed the seller was wearing a genuine smile. The man wasn't making sweets just so he could travel or marry. He was doing it because he truly loved the work. Santiago realized he could now sense when someone was following their personal legend just by looking at them. After the stall was up, the seller gave Santiago his first sweet of the day as a thank you. As Santiago walked away, a major realization hit him. While they were working together, the seller had spoken Arabic and Santiago had spoken Spanish, yet they had understood each other perfectly. He had just experienced the language of the world, which requires no words. Santiago realized that a language beyond words exists. He had already experienced this connection with his sheep, and now he was seeing it happen between people. He was discovering that many new things he was learning were actually experiences he'd had before, but had never truly perceived because he had become too accustomed to them. He concluded that if he could master this silent language, he could eventually understand the entire world. With a sense of calm and no rush, he decided to wander the narrow streets of Tangier to practice reading omens. He knew this would require immense patience, but he reminded himself that being a shepherd had already taught him that virtue. He saw clearly that the lessons from his old life were directly applicable to this strange new land because, as the king had said, all things are one. The scene shifts to the crystal merchant, who woke up with his usual daily anxiety. He owned his shop at the top of a steep hill for 30 years, and business was now poor. In the past, the shop had thrived. He had served Arab merchants, well-funded German soldiers, and French and English geologists. Back then, he had dreamed of becoming wealthy and surrounding himself with beautiful women as he aged. However, Tangier had changed. The nearby city of Ceuta had grown more rapidly, diverted trade, and caused neighbors to move away. Now, very few people were willing to climb the hill just to browse a few small shops. The merchant felt it was too late for him to change careers, as buying and selling crystal was the only thing he knew how to do.
The merchant spent the morning watching the quiet street, a routine he had followed for years. Just before lunch, he saw Santiago stop in front of the store. Though Santiago looked like an ordinary boy, the merchant's experienced eyes could tell he had no money. Still, the merchant decided to wait a few minutes before going to lunch until the boy moved on. Santiago noticed a sign in the doorway stating that several languages were spoken in the shop. Seeing the merchant behind the counter, Santiago made an offer. He would clean the glasses in the window because their current dirty state was discouraging customers. In exchange, he asked for something to eat. The merchant remained silent, so Santiago took the initiative. He pulled his jacket out of his pouch, reasoning he wouldn't need it in the desert anyway, and used it to clean the crystal. It took him half an hour to finish the window. Remarkably, while he was cleaning, 2 customers entered the shop and purchased items. Once the job was done, Santiago asked again for his meal. The merchant, acknowledging the work and the immediate change in fortune, invited Santiago to go have lunch with him. The merchant placed a sign on the shop door, and the two went to a nearby cafe. They sat at the only table in the establishment, and the merchant laughed. He explained that Santiago hadn't actually needed to clean anything to earn a meal. According to the Quran, the merchant was religiously obligated to feed anyone who was hungry. When Santiago asked why he had been allowed to work then, the merchant replied that the crystal was indeed dirty, and more importantly, both of them needed to cleanse their minds of negative thoughts. After their meal, the merchant offered Santiago a job. He noted that the arrival of 2 customers while the boy worked was a good omen. Santiago mused to himself that people often speak of omens without truly understanding them, just as he hadn't realized for years that he was communicating with his sheep through a language without words.
Santiago agreed to work, but with a specific condition. He would work for the rest of the day and all through the night until dawn, cleaning every piece of crystal in the shop. In return, he wanted enough money to reach Egypt the next day. The merchant laughed again, but this time it wasn't a light-hearted sound. He told Santiago that even if he cleaned every piece of glass for an entire year and earned a high commission on every sale, he still wouldn't have enough money to reach the pyramids. He explained that there were thousands of kilometers of desert between Tangier and Egypt. At that moment, a profound silence fell over Santiago, a silence so deep it felt as if the entire city had fallen asleep. The usual noise of the bazaars, the arguments of merchants, and the chanting from the towers all seemed to vanish. For Santiago, the world went quiet because his soul had fallen silent. In that instant, hope, adventure, the old king, his personal legend, and the treasure all seemed to disappear. He stared blankly out of the cafe, feeling so defeated that he wished he had died so that everything would simply end. The merchant watched the boy anxiously, noticing that the joy and life he had seen in him earlier that morning had completely vanished. Moved by compassion, the merchant offered to give Santiago the money he would need to return to his own country. Santiago remained silent for a long time. Eventually, he stood up, adjusted his clothes, and picked up his pouch. He told the merchant, "I'll work for you." After another long pause, he added a final thought that signaled he had given up on his dream for the time being. "I need money to buy some sheep."